So for this week, you watched a video from Adlit entitled Making Room for Adolescent Literacy, Part 1, The Adolescent Literacy Crisis. So I also wanted to create this PowerPoint to have us think about putting this crisis in context and thinking more about adolescents themselves. Excuse the title that I have here. It should read A Brief History of the Crisis, not An Brief History of the Crisis. So, A Nation at Risk was written and published in 1983, and this is what kind of got the discussion going about adolescent literacy instruction. So the authors found that 13% of all 17-year-olds in the U.S. at that time could be considered functionally illiterate, and that functional illiteracy among minority youth ran as high as 40%. The authors also found that the achievement among youth was lower than around the time Sputnik was launched. They found that youth lacked higher order thinking skills. Nearly 40% couldn't draw emphasis from reading material. Only 1/5 could write a persuasive essay, and only 1/3 could solve a mathematics problem requiring several steps. In 1984, when the NAEP report card came out, gains in reading amongst 13 and 17-year-olds had flatlined since 1971, according to those authors. So there was concern then, as it is now, that students were not academically prepared enough to be productive members of the workforce. So there's always been this focus on early childhood, primary grades, funding initiatives. But around the time that No Child Left Behind was coming into fruition, which was in the late 1990s, we then saw this shift back towards what do we do about adolescence or adolescent literacy in particular. So in the 21st century, policymakers began lamenting again the need to improve adolescent literacy skills so that youth were not only able to enter the workforce, but be able to compete on a global scale. But what these scholars, Vasudevan and Campano, what they asked us to do is look at our response as educators, policymakers, parents to this risk. The 2004 Reading at Risk report found a steep decline in literary reading, and there was a narrow view of what literacy and reading entailed, however, according to Vasudevan and Campano. And it's these kinds of reports that heighten the so-called crisis. So what they found in these type of reports was a pattern that was emerging where certain groups were marginalized, or their literacies or lack thereof are primarily framed through a deficit perspective. So for instance, there's a lot of focus on what adolescents lack and what the risks are, instead of how we can draw upon adolescents' knowledge and strengths. So Vasudevan and Campano state the assertion of expected reading difficulty is explained by pointing to socioeconomic factors such as dangerous neighborhoods and lack of access to educational resources, health, and nutrition, as well as sociocultural factors. In this explanation, culture is framed as a hindrance not only to literacy proficiency, which is reduced to reading comprehension, but also to academic achievement overall. Home literacies and family discourses are set as far removed from the expectations and norms of school and framed as a challenge to overcome. There is no discussion, for example, of engaging adolescents' native language stories as part of classroom life, nor is there recognition of the benefits of building adolescents' existing literacies, practices, or knowledge bases. So again, they're finding these tensions between cognitive and motivation theories, and then also sociocultural theories that ask us to look at, again, adolescents' background, knowledge, and interests. They also go on to say, we agree that there is more we need to know about effective adolescent literacy instruction, but knowing about teaching adolescents entails knowing more about the ways they use language and literacy in their lives. And so this type of tension a lot of times is what causes tension between qualitative and quantitative research. A lot of the reports that are put out are mostly quantitative research, but then there's qualitative researchers out there like myself that are also interested in the stories that we can listen to and think about, reflect upon from the mouths of adolescents themselves. What are they telling us? And it's not just them being numbers. So again, Vasudevan and Campano and hundreds of other researchers out there doing new work with adolescents, they urge us to begin with adolescents' lives as the starting point. So when we think about what is adolescence, Moji, another adolescent researcher, categorizes adolescence as the ages between 10 and 20, but sometimes you'll also see adolescents, the age range from 11 to 22. And Moji suggests there's two overarching ways that we typically frame adolescence, but then she also suggests a third of which is atypical when we think about adolescence. The first way then that we think about adolescence, according to Moji, is adolescence as raging hormones. Then we have the view of adolescence as becoming, or adolescence as in a state of confusion, or adolescence needing to mature and grow. But then Moji asks us to think of adolescence in a third way, which calls for us to reframe how we think of young people as a culture, studying youth as a resource, as a rich resource. So we don't want to denigrate youth culture, but we adults are there to help them think beyond where they are, what they know, or how they might see themselves. So the task then for you is when you go into classrooms, don't just think about what youth are not doing, but what they are doing. What literacy practices are they engaging in? Think literacies, not literacy. These kinds of observations are going to be hard and call for you to constantly have to disrupt particular kinds of thoughts and beliefs. But again, this is something that you have to do on a daily basis, minute by minute basis, catch the way that you're thinking about youth. But a lot of times, the reasons why it is hard for us to not be able to flip on that switch on or off in terms of us having deficit perspectives is because of all the pressures that are placed upon us. And now we're in the age of Common Core. And I'm not one to dismiss Common Core's efforts because I do think that there are standards that need to be in place. I'm more critical of the assessments that we're putting in place to implement the standards properly. So, what you have here, this picture you have here, are what Calkins, Aaronworth, and Lehman like to call curmudgeons, or these are the people that are the negative people, the people that are protesting, that have the angry, grumpy faces here that you see about Common Core, and maybe not stopping to think about some of the ways that we can use Common Core to our benefit. But what you need to think about when you're trying to unpack Common Core is that there is this de-emphasis on reader response theory, which you read about in Notice and Note Part 1 this week, that in terms of Rosenblatt's theory of, how does the text make you feel, or what can you relate to in the text, Common Core does not honor that type of thinking. They emphasize new criticism, which again you read about in Notice and Note for this week, and more about what does the text say, what's in the text. And I'm suggesting, just like I feel Beers and Probst are suggesting in Notice and Note, is that you need a good balance of both stances or theories when you are teaching kids and helping them to reach the standards for Common Core. So what you'll notice are a lot of the key elements in terms of what's new about Common Core in comparison to past standards that might have been out there. There's this progression towards more complex texts and a need for you all as English educators to scaffold these texts. There's an emphasis on the acquisition of academic language. They want kids routinely exposed to a variety of texts, including nonfiction, but that does not mean that we take out literary texts. That's why there's this push for literacy across the curriculum, because our colleagues in other subject areas should also be putting reading material in front of our students, namely nonfiction. And then writing across all disciplines and for real purposes. More narrative in K through 5, and then there's this switch to more expository and persuasive when you get 6th grade and beyond. But when I'm looking at the slides here, I see that I didn't end with adolescence, so I will just do that verbally, just to kind of bring it back. Again, we have all of these different pressures that we have to adhere to with Common Core, even some of the tests that you all have to take, EdTPA, OAEs, the list goes on, but still adolescents remain at the core. And so some of the activities that we do over the course of the semester, what I want you to really gain from some of these assignments, and when you are thinking about your curriculum, always keep going back to what are the strengths that adolescents are displaying in the classroom that I can build upon. And I know it's going to be hard, but that's where your mind needs to always focus on. What are their strengths, and how can I build upon those to then put all of these standards and curriculum guidelines into practice and into place. Until next week.